Well, welcome back to the EPS podcast where everything is a primary source. And today I'm joined by Erin, the tie-dyed librarian, and we had a plan to talk about one of your favorite stories. And I've known Erin, the tie-dyed librarian, for quite a while now, and you seem to cycle through a series of stories that you consider, I'd say, top 5 favorites. And the one we were going to talk about was Little Women, but instead we're going to be talking about Peter Pan.
So we decided to focus on Peter Pan today because we just attended a wonderful performance of Peter Pan. The cast did a wonderful job. It was very nice to see a live production of Peter Pan. I've seen many different film versions of it, and I've read many different novelizations and sequels and updates to it, but I had never seen... This is the second performance I've seen. The first one was years ago, and I don't remember a whole lot about it, but this was an especially memorable one because I took my son to see it, and it was his first time seeing a live show, and I just feel like Peter Pan is the perfect first show to see, especially for a little boy.
Yeah, and in order to analyze any of a play or a book or anything as a primary source, one of the questions comes up is who is the intended audience, and I think it's easy to say that no matter what version, whether it's a 1904 original play by J.M. Barrie or the subsequent Broadway musicals, and that's what essentially we saw tonight was a musical, or based on, in large part, the plot, the songs, and everything from the 1950s one. The intended audience is children.
Well, you would think that, although most of the people that were in attendance at the very first performance of Peter Pan were actually adults.
You're talking about over
in
100 years ago.
1904.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. It was 1904, so it's just kind of funny to us to think that because, I mean, most people didn't know what the play was going to be about because J.M. Barrie was so secretive about it. He even made all the cast and crew sign, like, basically confidentiality agreements so that they wouldn't talk about the play beforehand. So a lot of people showed up and they didn't really know what to expect. They didn't really expect to see a play about childhood. And so there weren't very many children in the audience. But now, of course, we think of it as the quintessential show about childhood. And, you know, the emphasis on children and families is something that kind of came about a little bit later. It wasn't necessarily there from the beginning, but that's certainly what it has become.
That's a great place to start, of course, because that is the first question, is what materials it's made from. And when it comes to a play, you don't think of it being based on any material. I mean, he had to write it down on paper. But I've mentioned the previous 2 episodes of the show that I'm moving away from this question of being about the physical, tangible material, and rather the topics or the ideas. And you were just saying that that's not something that went into his original mindset. But what was, in the movie Finding Neverland explores this a little bit, but what was the material that J.M. Barrie was working with? Where did he come up with these ideas for these characters like Peter Pan and... You know, because it's not folklore. He invented all these things, right?
Yeah, it's not really folklore, although, I mean, there is a text that precedes Peter Pan in terms of the character of Peter Pan. He has a book called The Little White Bird, which was published, I believe, in 1902. And the character of Peter Pan is actually mentioned in The Little White Bird as a boy who lives in Kensington Garden among the birds and fairies. And it's a little bit grim, if I recall. It's like Peter Pan is given the responsibility of burying the children who disobey their parents and stay overnight in Kensington Gardens, meaning that they don't survive, and that's why he's there to take care of those children afterwards.
And they put him on peanut butter labels. It's an incredible leap that they made.
Well, like we already said, though, Peter Pan, although it didn't necessarily start out as something about childhood, or at least people didn't see it that way, it really did become about childhood. And from what I read, it really seemed to become that way in the later half of the 20th century, is really when they started realizing, because television came along and the theater really wanted to keep people coming in, so they realized that rather than just appealing to adults who were theater buffs, they really needed to start bringing in entire families. So they decided to put on more family-friendly shows, and Peter Pan is the ultimate family show. I mean, I just said that's the first show I took my young son to see, and you know, a lot of parents probably felt the same way, and especially it became a tradition to have this show around Christmas time, because Christmas is obviously,
Yeah,
a time of
it's a,
great childhood wonder too. So it's just, kind of going off of that idea.
so I guess in order to move things in, the direction that we want to go in, we need to nail down which version we're talking about. And we will, of course, have to bounce around between all the different Peter Pans. So we could talk about Peter Pan, the original play, Peter Pan, the character, which preceded the original play, Peter Pan, the book, Peter and Wendy, which came out 7 years after the play.
I think it was published in 1911.
Yeah, to kind of clean up some of the things that had come up and then of course, and then you have Peter Pan, the Broadway show, Peter Pan, the Disney movie. It seems that all of the different versions of the story borrow from each other. So I think to nail down, I think tonight we should really focus on what we just saw, which was the musical. And even though what we saw here in 2021 updates some things, makes some adjustments, they still based what they did on the music and the plot. The material that play, that musical had was the story of Peter Pan. And if I did my timeline correctly, I feel that the Disney Peter Pan came out 1 year before the Broadway Peter Pan. And that seems to go right with what you were just saying about really trying to go after the child audience and get them excited about this because, Disney, of course, that's their target audience is kids. And so when the Broadway producer gets the rights to making this Peter Pan musical, it was towards kids. And so what does that tell you about 1950s America, that children were, really the focal point of mass media, that they weren't looking towards older people, they weren't looking towards, they were looking at teenagers, obviously, also. I mean, that was a big part of the, for pop music and, stuff too. But what was it about the time period that children become a demographic?
Well, I think, and I know we keep saying we need to talk about the version that Seacoast Repertory Theater put on right here in 2021. But I think one of the biggest differences between some of the previous productions of Peter Pan and the one in the 50s, the Disney animated one, is that is the first time in history that Peter Pan was actually played by a boy, a young boy at that. Bobby Driscoll is the young voice actor who was Peter Pan, and before that it had always been tradition for a young woman to play Peter Pan because there are a lot of laws about child labor and things like that, so child actors often couldn't work a number of hours, at nighttime or whatever. Mm-hmm. So that's why Peter Pan was often played by a young woman. And I mean, in many of the professional productions, even the darling children are played by adults or young adults too. I mean, young looking ones, but mm-hmm. But that was also something that we noted in the Seacoast Repertory Theater, is that in many even modern productions, it's a woman or a young girl playing Peter Pan. But Seacoast Repertory Theater had a young man playing Peter Pan, which, again, kind of breaks with tradition because not that many versions actually have a young man playing Peter Pan, because Peter Pan is supposed to be an eternally young boy. And, like I said, it's usually played by a very young woman who, has some kind of androgynous appeal rather than a young man.
So, I mean, the story itself, moving towards the idea of, I guess Peter Pan, like you said, has gone through these different evolutions. And do you see a time that the story will ever go away? Or do you think, I mean, I guess it's barely survived a century, but...
I don't really think it's going to go away because I noted tonight as I was watching it, that they had made, some updates and some little revisions here and there. And that always startles me at first because I feel like there are some texts that are, untouchable. They're sacrosanct. And for some of those, for me, are, the Secret Garden or Little Women or Peter Pan. I just feel like they're, perfect in their original state. But then, of course, I can reflect back on them as a scholar and think actually some of them are a little bit problematic in terms of the way that they represent, certain demographics of people. So then I realized, oh, okay, well, if we want them to stay relevant, then they have to be able to change and adapt. And the more I thought about it, I thought, well, actually, when Peter Pan first went on stage, J.M. Barrie made revisions. Sometimes he would rewrite scenes, like, from night to night, which was probably really frustrating for the original actors. But if J.M. Barrie thought it was perfectly fine to rewrite his play, again and again, and take things out or make changes or develop characters or whatever, then nobody should feel offended that it's still happening. In fact, that's kind of a tradition in itself now, is making little changes in order to keep the play relevant. And I was going to say, additionally, with the idea of Peter Pan being played by a young man, I noticed tonight in the production that there was a lot more gender swapping in the roles than had been previous. For example, in this production of Peter Pan, Captain Hook was played by a woman.
And all
of the pirates were played by women too, which at first kind of catches you off guard because we've been so used to seeing them all as men. But the more I think about it, the more I think it kind of makes sense because, like I said, there's already a lot of kind of gender play in Peter Pan. I mean, Peter, he's supposed to be a young boy, but he's often played by a young woman, or he's played by a young man, or, there's already a lot of kind of gray area. And even when I think about the classic Broadway production, the Mary Martin one from the 1950s, Captain Hook was played brilliantly by, a classic actor named Cyril Ritchard. And Cyril Ritchard played Captain Hook as kind of effeminate. He had ruffled cuffs at his coat sleeves, and he had like a beauty mark, and he had a nicely coiffed wig, and he does all these little delicate dances like waltzes and tarantellas. And so it kind of makes sense. It doesn't seem strange to me that maybe through time we would start to think like, oh, well, why not a woman Captain Hook?
Yeah.
Why not a female band of pirates?
I mean, even J.M. Barrie was fluid with the way that he treated the character. Didn't he add on things about Captain Hook? Like, oh, yeah, he graduated from Eton College.
J.M. Barrie did a number of addresses at, like, different, universities and things. And at one of them, he talks about how Captain Hook was a graduate of Eton, and the way that he really developed the character in a way that really, it doesn't have to do with, it does have to do with the play, but it was outside of the play.
Yeah.
I mean, he was just giving this address to a bunch of college graduates talking about a character that he made up himself.
And that brings me to the next question is, who made it? And when it comes to Peter Pan, it seems that who makes it is whoever is quite literally making it. So, as mentioned, we just saw a local production of it, and even though the story comes from J.M. Barrie and the script comes from the 1950s and the music and everything, it seems to be wherever the time and the place that it's actually made, they take a bit of ownership of it, and that tells you about who they are and the community and the society around them. In their culture. But let's start with the originator of this. Who made it? It was J.M. Barrie. And what was his status in society? And I mentioned earlier about the movie Finding Neverland, and they bring this up a little bit, that he wasn't a lower, class nobody. He was also not, on the same level as some of the other nobility of the day or anything like that. But was he already a writer? I mean, before, was he making a
was
living
a
that way?
writer. I don't know if he was incredibly successful before Peter Pan. I think Peter Pan is really what launched him, into being a household name. I don't know how successful he was before that. Like I said, I knew that he was a writer, and I know that he was kind of known around his neighborhood, but I don't know if he was necessarily famous before then.
And like I said, it certainly elevated him to that status, and as a playwright. And so, as we move along this, why did he make Peter Pan? What was his original reasoning behind making the play Peter Pan? It had something to do with his neighbors, or?
Well, the movie Finding Neverland, you know, is kind of a nice generalization of what happened between J.M. Barrie and the Llewellyn Davies family. You know, Sylvia Llewellyn Davies is often thought to be the inspiration for Mrs. Darling. And as Finding Neverland shows, she was a mother. I think the movie only shows 3 boys, but I think in actuality there were 5 boys, and she was married. The movie conveniently kind of cuts out the husband because apparently there was a lot of tension between Arthur Llewellyn Davies and J.M. Barrie. You know, there was an actual father in the picture for much of the time, and you know he didn't always take kindly to this man coming around and spending so much time with his wife and his children.
Yeah.
But apparently towards the end of his life, he did kind of accept J.M. Barrie as a friend of the family, and he approved the official adoption of the boys to J.M. Barrie after he died, and then subsequently his wife also died. And so, you know, I think towards the end there was a little bit more acceptance, but Peter Pan is, you know, supposedly comes out of the time and the stories that J.M. Barrie had with the Llewellyn Davies boys. One of them was named Michael, one of them was named Peter, and one of them was named John. So, I mean, you can definitely see where the names come from.
Yeah.
But the stories, and there's even some photographs that exist of, you know, them acting out these fun stories that they made up. And you can definitely see where they got the ideas for the costumes of Peter Pan. And of course, J.M. Barrie had a dog. It wasn't named Nana, but I think it was a Newfoundland dog.
Did it take care of the kids as the way that Nana does in the...
Well, I think it was probably a gentle giant, but I don't think it brought them medicine or anything like that.
Well, it's too bad. So that, you know, so he made the play in 1904 as, you know, I suppose that's what you did then. I know film was in its infancy in 1904, so his mindset probably wasn't like, I have this series of stories, I'm going to make it into a movie. That would not come until at least a few decades later that would be somebody's first thought was, you know, I think about another story like Gone with the Wind, which was written in the 30s, which is the height of Hollywood. It's, you know, the golden age of Hollywood. So even though Margaret Mitchell writes it as a novel, she's I'm sure immediately thinking in terms of movies. You know, the story is being told as a movie would. Whereas I don't think that the original one was meant to be, I'm going to show the world these stories that these boys come up with, and that I'm going to put it into play form because that's what people do in 1904. That's how you tell a story.
Well, I don't think that he necessarily intended it to ever be a movie, or maybe he didn't even think necessarily about the role that technology could play in bringing his stories to life, but there definitely is a relationship between technology advances and the way that Peter Pan gets portrayed. I mean, in the early 1900s, electricity was still a novelty to most people, but, you know, they use an electric light as Tinkerbell. There's not an actress playing Tinkerbell. It's just a little electric light, but that was pretty amazing to people because most people still didn't have electricity. And also the mechanisms that they used to make the people fly. You know, most stage shows didn't have people flying around on wires. That was a special kind of effect that they had to use, and the actors all had to be trained on how to do that and how to make it look natural and everything. So I don't know if he necessarily thought about that, but there's definitely a relationship that starts then and continues now as to the way that technology really impacts the way that different generations experience the story of Peter Pan.
And, you know, to continue on with that, you know, the why did they make it? We can leap ahead to another version of it, the 1953 Disney movie. And that goes without saying. Why did they make it? Well, they had already by this point become hugely successful with animating so many other classic stories, most of them fairy tales, you know, from well before. But the idea of being able to make it look like children fly in an animated cartoon is beyond easy. That it doesn't take much effort at all. And so this almost like this story of Peter Pan was tailor-made for the Disney catalog of, you know, let's make these movies. And, you know, that if you go over to the other side, what does that tell you? Like you just said, for the early 20th century, you know, it tells us, you know, why did they make it is because that's, you know, it tells us that was the height of technology. That was how, you know, if you were going to broadcast your story, you know, that's how you did it. You know, it's 2021. If we're going to broadcast our ideas about Peter Pan, we do it on a podcast. We don't, you know, I wouldn't go and rent out a theater and give a speech, about this night after night, or have a conversation on stage. We were going to record it, and you know, thousands of people will listen to it, I'm sure. And then, so that brings us to the next part. 1954 is when the first version of what we saw today has its appearance. And I have to think that the reason why they made it not only is because the rights to the characters became available, but because of the great success Disney was having with the movies. The 50s were a huge transition time when it came to entertainment because movies were on their way out as far as being the core go to, let's go to the movies. And television was quickly taking over. And when I was looking into the story of the Mary Martin Broadway version, it said that it only ran for about a year intentionally because they had to shut down so that they could appear on television. NBC had paid them the rights to broadcast the play, and I think that's the version that we've seen. They broadcasted the musical of Peter Pan 3 times.
Well, the version that I usually see is actually the one from from 1960.
Yeah.
But there were televised versions of the Peter Pan Broadway play before that.
And that goes
They're
right...
just a little bit harder to find. When you think of Mary Martin as Peter Pan, most people think of the 1960 one because it's colorized, and that's the one that was on VHS for so long. Mm-hmm. But I know that there were other versions before that.
And, that goes right into, so why did they make it? They made it so that they could be on TV. And what does that tell you about 1950s? That tells you that there was a major transition afoot from movie audiences to TV, Broadway audiences to TV, and it was almost like they were trying to appeal to the TV audiences and saying, this is what's happening.
Well, yeah, I mean, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, of the Broadway production of Peter Pan was very successful. I think Cyril Richard, again, who played Captain Hook, got a Tony for his performance. So it wasn't that it was not successful. It was very, very successful. But why limit yourself to just the children who live in the Manhattan area if you have a chance to broadcast to children across the entire country? I mean, it makes perfect sense.
I'm curious if between the two, the Disney version and the Broadway one that was broadcast on TV, which one gets more credit or deserves more credit when it comes to making Peter Pan what it has become to you and I and to children, throughout since that time? Is it, when we got home, we watched the 2003 one that came out, and we were saying how it borrows a lot from almost all the versions of the story. That you can see elements of the Disney one with the way that the first meeting happens and the way Tinkerbell looks pretty much like the Disney Tinkerbell, but then the scene where Tinkerbell drinks the poison and is dying, the I Believe in Fairies comes directly from the Broadway play, which does that come from the J.M. Barrie one, do you know?
I believe that J.M. Barrie did have that part about, if you believe in fairies, you must clap your hands, because that way he knew that there would be children or people enjoying the play. And if I remember correctly, he was actually very nervous that maybe people wouldn't understand that the actors were giving a direction or that maybe they weren't enjoying it. And I believe he had some kind of plants in the audience that would clap just in case people didn't clap immediately. I don't think that was the issue. I think, his audiences understood and really enjoyed being engaged that way. But yeah, and then even in the novelization in 1911, I remember reading that for the first time and kind of thinking to myself, okay, well, we're at that part. How is he going to build in this part about clap your hands to the audience? And I believe the novel says something along the lines of, and the children didn't know it, but in their dreams that night, they received the instructions, and every child in the world was clapping in their dreams for Tinkerbell, something like that. He kind of explains it like in their subconscious they're doing it.
I almost see it as like a rite of passage for kids nowadays, is to when you get to participate in reviving Tinkerbell. I was recalling that I saw the musical version on the stage version, we'll call it, when I was a kid, and I remember that vividly, feeling how great it was when they were not only playing to me, through the entire show is geared towards a young audience, but also wanting me to take part. And I think throughout all of these different versions, what we can keep getting out of it is that it tells us that children were becoming so much more relevant from the beginning of the 20th century all the way to the present. And, they are not only relevant, but seen as, a very important, you've done work on, the kind of the history of childhood. And it seems that it coincides pretty well with the early 20th century that children being seen as having a very important part of anybody's life is to have a childhood where play and imagination come first before pulling your own weight around the house or doing anything like that. And it seems that I don't think it's coincidence that these stories have appeared in media at these different milestones in that evolution of children being just having
Well,
more of a
yeah, I
place.
mean, the more advanced we get as a society with our technology and modernization, the more leisure time we have, and the more leisure time that we have, the more leisure time we're able to spend with children. And there's become a great importance now in making sure that our children have wonderful magical childhoods, and we do everything possible, including taking them to Disney World, to make it that way. Like, we want our children to have magical childhoods, even if it means we are spending thousands of dollars on it.
Yeah.
So
And think about who long has been the mascot of Disney, flying into the view of the Magic
exactly.
Kingdom and putting her little fairy dust on as Tinkerbell. So I think we've pretty much determined the next question. Actually, there's another one involved here. Where was it made, and or what locations are associated with this source? So the original one was made in England, made in London, and it was for the London stage, right?
Hmm.
Was it the West End? That's where they put their shows on, right?
I think so.
And in America, Broadway. I was looking into the Mary Martin version, and apparently it premiered in San Francisco. It was a West Coast show, and they said it really didn't have the same kind of impact that they were hoping, and they had to bump it up a little bit by adding some more songs, including the one about Neverland, which I'm surprised that they didn't have a song about Neverland in the original script, which is, the next question is what locations are associated with this source? No matter where it's told or in what version, with the exception of last year's movie that came out, Wendy, which we can touch on if you'd like, but all of the stories are the same exact setting. Even Hook goes back to that setting
Yeah,
of the Darlings nursery
it's
in
the
London.
quintessential London, as somebody would see it as if they were flying over. I mean, you get all the major landmarks, right? You get London Bridge, you get Big Ben, you see all the typical, like, the ways that the homes look there, kind of like those brownstones,
Yeah.
like urban homes. I mean, that's what you would see if you were just passing over England, like if you were flying over it, like Peter Pan.
In the ride
And
at Disney World.
in Hook, Peter Banning, it comes out that he was adopted by American family, but he still has to go back to England in order to be found and in order to kind of start
Yeah.
this journey. And when he gets there, it's all the typical stuff. He's going back, and Grandma Wendy's house is very English ladylike, and they go to a benefit for the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, which is actually who has the rights to Peter Pan, because that's what Jay and Barry left them to. And they take a ride in a taxi, and they see you can see Big Ben, and they even mention that they're going to number 14 because in the book the Darling family lives at number 14, of course. So I mean, it's all those typical things.
It should also be pointed out in the movie Hook that he flies across the ocean on a Pan Am airline, which is, I think, a nice little touch that they added in there. And I'll just point this out right now. I never quite understood why there was a coach bus line named after Peter Pan. I mean, I get it because transportation, you're moving from one place to another, and he does that all the time. Apparently, he comes back from Neverland to London to hear stories and goes back and reports them. But you would think Peter Pan would be more for like a helicopter, not a giant bus with
Yeah.
it doesn't really work the
The
same way.
bus doesn't fly.
Right, it doesn't fly, and helicopters are a little bit more Peter Pan esque. Kind of nimble and moving around with ease, and buses kind of anyway. But the locations associated with this. Where is Neverland? What is Neverland in your opinion?
Well, I mean, if you want the directions, as Peter Pan says, it's second star to the right and straight on till morning. But I mean, the way that it's kind of described in the book, at least, is like kind of it's an island that every child has inside them, and so every child's Neverland is different. And they say, one of the children, I think it's Wendy, who has like some wolf cubs in hers, and John has a lagoon with flamingos flying over it, and then he kind of makes a funny little pun, and he says, but Michael, who was still very young, his Neverland was a flamingo with lagoons flying over it, because he doesn't really understand what either one is. He just kind of wants to be like his brother.
Yeah.
So I guess if you're going with that, Neverland can be anything to anyone. It depends on what you want it to be.
I think whenever they present it in, whether it's on stage, in in movies, they broadcast it on television a couple years ago again in 2013. That they seem to have the old standbys. Of course, there's where the pirates live, where sometimes it's just one ship,
The Jolly
Jolly
Roger.
Roger. Other times, like in Hook, it's an entire village that they've created around it. They have the Lost Boys. They have some kind of presence there, and then there's the native population, which I really appreciated the most recent version that we saw, as in a few hours ago, that they call them natives as a more modern, updated way of, instead of referring to them as American Indians. But then they actually refer to them as native Neverlandians. And I appreciate that, because so if you're going to call them natives, obviously somebody from North America would not be native to Neverland. That doesn't make sense. So I liked the way that they were presented as native Neverlandians. I think that was interesting and very telling of, the sensitivities that people have in the modern era.
The history of, the Indians, as they're originally called, in Peter Pan has been, very problematic, obviously. Originally, when the play came out, if they were even in the original script, I mean, the script has been changed so many times, if they were even there at first, it wasn't a problem. Most people didn't even really have a problem with it in the Disney animated version from the 50s. And obviously that is under a lot of criticism. But, since then, people have realized, oh, this is not sensitive, it's not inclusive, like, we need to move beyond this. So, I mean, it's been problematic for decades now. But the way that modern versions of Peter Pan, like modern stage productions, get around it is always interesting to note, because obviously they want to be sensitive, they don't want to risk angering anyone or alienating anybody, and they also obviously just want to show that we've moved beyond those ideas. Yeah. But sometimes it comes across as very awkward. Like you just said, you can't really call them Native Americans in a play that exists in a fantasy world, because it doesn't really work. But the way that the production did it tonight, I really enjoyed, because they made that native Neverlandians into more like a fairy mythical type creature. Like one of them, like the Tiger Lily princess, had pointed ears like an elf, and they all had blue hair, and they had lots of face paint.
They almost reminded me of the characters from Avatar, which
I think
had a lot of.
I mean,
that even has some parallels to Peter Pan as well, of going to a different world and kind of within one's mind in a way. I was just looking this up about Buffalo Bill, and his Wild West show. And, he was in operation around, as of the 1904, early 1900s, and would take his Wild West show on the road all over the world. And one of the features was Native Americans. He would have, and his mentality was that with a lot of other progressives of his time, was that the Native American was uh, they were fading away, and that he wanted to try his best to show the world what their culture was like before they went away forever and were transformed forever. And I think that their incorporation into the story of Peter Pan represents, considering where it was written and where it takes place, was representing some, to a young English kid, the ultimate adventure and far off place that Western America, we we live in the United States, and we just recently got to Arizona as in this past few weeks. So I can imagine that an English audience in 1904, 1911, that is just as much of, they are just as removed from the western part of the United States as they are from this mythical, fantasy world of Neverland. And so those characters belong there just as much as they,
Yeah.
as anywhere else. But as time has gone on, even as early as the 1953 Disney one, it's awkward. It's not,
Yeah.
I could see, I could imagine, I mean, it's very cringy to watch it now. And in that time period, it, I mean, that was, I guess you could go either way. Some audiences probably saw nothing wrong with it. Others may have felt that it was, very wrong. But clearly, that has become one of the major parts of the story that has also changed with the times.
Well, and it's interesting too because I mean, if you want to talk specifically about film representations of the Indians in Neverland, I mean, like we said, it definitely can be kind of awkward. And the 1991 film Hook, they I guess just didn't really want to deal with it, and they kind of took out that element altogether. I mean, you don't see anything like
Yeah,
that,
they
and you only
mention
get
them, but
they get like maybe a mention. Like at one point, Smee says, "How about we shoot some Indians out of Long Tom?" And Captain Hook just kind of dismisses it, like, "Oh, I don't want to kill Lost Boys and Indians. I've been killing them most of my life," and that's pretty much the end of the story there.
yeah,
And we don't even see them, and that was probably their way of compromising and saying like, okay, well, we've mentioned them, but we really don't want to get into any uncomfortable areas about trying to show them, especially considering that by the 90s, I mean, this was, I believe, before the Disney animated film Pocahontas. But I mean, by the time Pocahontas came out, people were already realizing like we really should not be giving these messages to our children. At least some of them. I
yeah.
admit that I love the music to Pocahontas, but it definitely makes us reconsider the way that we portray things.
Well,
And I was gonna say, furthermore, the 2003 film Peter Pan, I think, for me, gets a lot of credit because they didn't take out that element. Because I think that just totally deleting the element is also kind of offensive. Like they're not even worth thinking about.
yeah.
Which like I said, I know that they were trying to avoid some awkwardness, but when you think about like just deleting them entirely, it also doesn't really seem to make it right. But the 2003 film adaptation of Peter Pan used a wonderful young actress. Her name was Carson Gray. I had to look it up actually, but I remember when I originally watched the DVD commentary for that movie because I had to buy the DVD as soon as it came out. It talked about how she is actually part Haida, which is an indigenous community from I think Canada, and in the movie she's actually speaking the real language, like rather than try to get around it or cast somebody and try to make them look Native American or native or whatever. They actually went out of their way to cast a young girl, and not only does she look the role, she actually speaks the role too. And I think that that actually brought a lot more credibility
Mm-hmm.
and dignity to the role too, because she does a wonderful job in it.
It's I was in my last episode of this program. I was speaking with Kyle about, and he pointed out very well. The '90s were very much a transitional era. It was a lot of self realizing, and I think Pocahontas fits in well there of saying, let's transition away from the way that Disney and other media used to depict Native Americans, and it's not quite perfect, but it's getting there. It's definitely an improvement. And then to go ahead 10 years, and then 10 years after that, you can see some.
And to be perfectly honest, I was thinking about this after I started kind of thinking more about how I mentioned that Captain Hook in this production was a woman and all the pirates were women too. I was thinking it's not even just a problem of certain, races or nationalities that get portrayed in some of these stories and, these touchstone texts. I mean, it's also the ways that they kind of portray, genders and sexes. Like Peter Pan has a lot of problems with the way it kind of favors the wonderfulness of being a boy over the way that girls are portrayed. And I mean, they're either jealous like Tinkerbell
Yeah.
or like the mermaids in some productions, or they're just kind of like prim and proper and just obsessed with being a mother like Wendy. I mean, there's no room for like a really wonderful dynamic female character. But I think that we've really seen a change in that, because even if you think back to the 1991 movie Hook, and that Tinkerbell looked a lot different than what most people realized, most people thought she looked like, because most people were familiar with the animated Tinkerbell.
Yeah.
But instead, they had Julia Roberts, and she was wearing kind of like a baggy, leafy, brownie kind of thing. And I think she just has like bare feet in it for at least some of it. And she's got short hair that's kind of like a reddish, brownish color. I mean, she doesn't look like the kind of pinup girl Tinkerbell.
Yeah. I think that was the
from
first
the 50s.
movie.
And then even if you kind of move forward with that, I mean, if you think about the 2003 film of Peter Pan, Wendy, she's still Wendy, but she kind of has a little bit more to go on. Not only does she kind of play the action hero when she's playing with her brothers in the nursery, but she even, goes to Captain Hook and kind of thinks like, wouldn't it be fun to be a pirate? Like, think about what people would say, if this young girl became a pirate. And she wants to sword fight along Peter Pan, not just stand on a rock while he saves her.
They set up her situation a lot differently in the 2003 movie than they do in previous versions.
And I'm glad that they did that, because I think that really paved the way for that movie that you mentioned earlier, the movie that came out, what was it, last year, that was actually just called Wendy, which caught a lot of people's attention, because we've always found this story told from a male perspective, whether it's Peter Pan or the 1991 film Hook, or even some versions that are just Pan. I mean, it's always from one of the male perspectives. And so getting the film that was along the same lines, it used the same text as the basis, but it was coming from a female perspective, and it was actually titled from the female perspective of Wendy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that also shows a great shift in the way that we want to have these stories reflect lots of different people, not just the classic text. We want it to appeal to lots of different audiences.
Peter Pan seems to definitely be a lot more fluid than some of the other stories that oftentimes fit into this category. Like I said at the beginning of this, either your favorite stories or just classic stories that either have been around long enough or have just kind of fit into our lexicon or just pop culture in general, that this one does a nice job of being movable with the time period. It's not as strict.
I haven't even mentioned some of the things that I really enjoyed about the performance tonight. So the character of Liza, which most people kind of forget about, but she's basically the only human servant in the Darling household, because Nana the dog, of course, tends to the children. But then there's this other character of Liza, and she's usually kind of portrayed as wearing kind of like a maid's type outfit. But in the performance tonight, in the nursery scene that opens the show, I just saw this girl with like a windbreaker on and leg warmers, and she was listening to what looked like a Walkman, or at least pretending to listen to it. And she had her hair in a crimped ponytail. I saw her kind of like wander onto the stage, and I was like, why is this person just wandering onto the stage?
Yeah.
It really did not even occur to me that she was in the play, because she looked so different than the way that the other people looked. And then I realized, like, oh, that's the character of Liza. That's why she's just kind of sitting on the bed and not really paying attention to the children. She's kind of annoyed with them at the moment, because they made Liza look like she's from, I don't know, either the late 80s or the early 90s, because she's wearing the windbreaker and she's got her, her eyeshadow and her perfect pink lipstick on. And I realized that there were other little nods to that time period throughout the performance. And I'm thinking now, like, okay, it's 2021. They probably realized that the people who are paying for the tickets to this show to take their children, like me, are people that had that as part of their childhood. So again, we're kind of getting wrapped up with this idea of Peter Pan being connected to our childhood, and that's what it does all the time. I mean, this production of Peter Pan that I saw tonight was particularly appealing to people like me who grew up in that time period. Just as I remember thinking this when I was younger, I didn't understand why they had some of these references in the movie Hook, but they specifically show that Moira has Beatles sheets on her bed, and I always thought that was kind of weird, and I was like, who cares about the Beatles? But I realized that the people paying for the movie tickets, like my parents, my mom and my aunt specifically, they would have been growing up in the 60s, so it was appealing to them.
Peter Banning saying, oh, I...
Exactly. Peter Banning makes that remark about, oh, I missed the 60s, and I was an accountant or whatever. That was appealing to the parents, because it's showing the parents that, it's understanding that their parents now, this Neverland is not really a part of their possibilities or their life anymore, just as the way that this one was showing me tonight. And there were other little nods too.
Oh, there was plenty of props.
I noticed the little boys were kind of playing with G.I. Joes at one point.
And there was
a light bright instead of a lantern, things like that.
Candy and and it's perfectly fitting for our generation in particular, in that we are almost an entire generation of Peter Pans.
Yeah, definitely.
That, the fact that we're going on to nearly an hour of listening to a cat sneeze, but also an hour of talking about media, because our generation in particular has had a lot of difficulty leaving our childhood behind. And if anything, we've been encouraged not to.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the way that everything is getting rebooted and reimagined, I mean, they didn't bring back Saved by the Bell because, the 10-year-olds want it. They brought it back because the people who are pushing 40 want it.
Or
just...
fill in the blank, anything else.
Exactly, anything else. I watched the entire Punky Brewster reboot in like a day.
I was intending so much for this particular episode to get away from the 80s and 90s, because that's, that was the focus of the first two episodes, and I was hoping, I'd go back in time, 1904. This will be perfect, but it all comes back again. It's just, I'm glad we changed our mind as far as who and what we talked about tonight, because, and I do want to go back to Little Women at some point, which, as far as I know, is related to Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. That was the sequel, right? It was Little Women.
Yeah.
And you can clarify at a later podcast about that one, but I'm glad we talked so much about Peter Pan.
I mean, how little are they, really?
Right. I think that's a reference to another 90s property, right? Friend. So I think we've covered the next part, who the intended audience. I think we've pretty much said
I think we've talked about the intended audiences for like every single production of Peter Pan that ever was.
If anything, that's ultimately what this entire thing tells us about, is the intended audience. And that they are an audience that 100 years ago they weren't, but now they are. And they'll probably continue to be. And we've also very much covered the topic of what ideas or behaviors does this convey. And, in a couple different respects, I guess we can rehash or just review some of these. That everlasting youth, the idea of not wanting to confront adulthood for as long as possible. I see a lot of memes and even T-shirts and bags and stuff like that say, like, no adulting for me today. Not wanting to grow up, never, and that was something that seemed like a fantasy back in the 50s when the first one, these musical versions came out, the Disney and the Broadway one, but now that seems like an option.
I mean, I definitely think you're right. I mean, nobody wants to leave their childhood and their innocence behind. I mean, we think we do, but that's really what the bittersweet truth of Peter Pan is. We all think that we want to grow up, You think about it, like, when I grow up, I'm going to never clean my room. I'm going to stay up as late as I want. Like, even, like, it's December right now, so of course we're watching Home Alone a lot right now, and Kevin kind of says, like, when I grow up and get married, I'm living alone. Like, when you're a kid, you're constantly thinking about what you're going to do differently as an adult. But then when you become an adult, you realize, like, man, I didn't even enjoy my childhood. I was so busy thinking about, like, how to get out of being a kid. Like, I want to be able to not brush my teeth. I want to be able to not clean my room. I want to be able to watch TV whenever I want to. That you don't even fully enjoy your childhood. I don't even think it's I don't even think it's really possible to fully enjoy your childhood because you're always thinking about, what you're not getting yet, and then when you're an adult, you always think about like, what did I miss out on?
Yeah.
And that's really, like I said, that's really the bittersweet part about Peter Pan is just this constant yearning. It's yearning for children to have what they want, and it's yearning for adults to go back in time. And I mean, there's even yearning for parents. I mean, we yearn to see our children stay babies forever. That's how the story of Peter Pan opens. It's when Wendy realizes that she first must grow up, it's because she runs with her mother with a flower, and the mother says, "Oh, why can't you stay like this forever?" I mean, as parents, it's horrible to watch your children grow up because you just know that they're getting further and further away. When you talk about, the intended audience, it's children, but it's also anybody that ever was a child.
Yeah, and that's everybody. And so what those ideas and behaviors convey, that tells us about, just again milestones throughout the 20th century of the evolution of children, child rearing, and child development. You think about again in the 1950s. This novel idea, Dr. Spock, who I used to get so confused with when people would talk about Dr. Spock, the child doctor, and versus the guy from Star Trek. I'm like, what does that guy have to do with it? But that whole idea of focusing on children, making them feel special, allowing them to have a
showing
childhood.
your affection to them.
Yeah, not hiding
not
those
treating
things.
them like miniature adults.
Right. That was a novel thing in the 1950s. It was just newly tried out for that baby boomer generation, who are our parents, and so that like fairy dust trickled down to us, and I think that's why it continues to, is because we can tell that these stories, when they were presented in cartoon form and they were presented on the stage in musical form and then televised that way, weren't there to tell a bit, to talk to parents about, don't you remember when you were a kid? It was speaking directly to kids and parents at the same time, and that goes perfectly with the ideas of the era. So I've had a wonderful time talking to you about Peter Pan, and we kind of spread it on thick.
Yeah.
Like
well, it's hard to really
butter,
limit a conversation like this because, I mean, Peter Pan has been around for well over 100 years now, and like we said, it's continually being reimagined and adapted and revised, and I mean each generation's experience of Peter Pan is different than the next one, which is different than the last one and the previous one. So I mean it's hard to really limit it, but I think we did a good idea of talking about the themes.
Earlier I asked you if you had any predictions about, do you picture that this story will last forever? I mean, I guess there are stories that have been around forever.
Well, Shakespeare still gets produced, and Shakespeare's been around for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and
it gets reimagined, and
even Greek dramas, Oedipus, and so I guess it's not a foolish idea, but same thing. I remember being, pretty young, and I probably along the same lines of this. They used to do a Shakespeare production in the summertime in the park. And it was trying to draw in a younger audience to come see Shakespeare, and they would, even though kind of like the Romeo and Juliet from the 90s and 10 Things I Hate About You and O and all those adaptations of it, they didn't update the language in it, but they updated their clothing. Like they were dressed as modern day people and performing, I forget which one I saw it was, but it was along those same lines of like trying to get to a different demographic. And so I'm curious if Peter Pan, and they did try a couple years ago, and I think failed miserably, to try to make it more, I don't want to say adult, but just, they took a much different approach about it. What was that one that came out a couple years ago, just called like Pan, or?
Is that the one that has the pirates like singing Nirvana and
yeah.
I mean, there were I kind of like gave them credit for trying things.
Yeah.
Because I mean, Peter Pan has been a musical for a long time now, and it makes sense. Just like we talked about, the story gets updated. It would make sense that at some point the music would get updated too. But it just, I guess it didn't come off the way they were hoping.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some parts of that are enjoyable to watch, but as a whole, I wasn't really impressed with it.
I think that the stage version, the musical, as long as it continues to move around like the one that we witnessed today, it will stand the test of time. But in the movie, because people aren't impressed in movies to see somebody flying anymore. That's not. I'm not. Whoa! I gotta go to the movie. It's not like 1978 Superman.
That Walt Disney is planning. They've been doing all these like live action remakes of classic animated movies. Well, I heard that Peter Pan is up for one soon, so we'll see how it goes.
I suppose, but I mean, again, I'm not. They've perfected. They've mastered in movie making in general. They've mastered how to make somebody look like they're flying. They did that back in. I mean, Robin Williams looked like he was flying back in 1991. So nobody's gonna be running to the theaters and be like, oh, I got to see the effects. Whereas when you go to see the live performance, for a fact that they're going to be wearing some kind of cable, and it's going to be kind of a fun way to see how they put it on and take it off without much fuss about it, make it seamless as possible, and that's part of like the art of stagecraft. And I appreciate that much more. So in a way, I think that the stage version has a much longer lifespan in it than the movie versions, unless they get really inventive like they did with Wendy, because otherwise it's just going to be, oh, here's this story again, and again and again, and it'll keep going forever and ever. So thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it enough that you'll come back another time.
Well, thank you for asking me. I really appreciate it. I don't get to talk Peter Pan nearly enough.
No, and if anybody I'd like to talk to about it is the Tie-Dyed Librarian. So thanks again, and thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything, including all versions of the story Peter Pan, is a primary source. We'll see you next time.